For the next 2 minutes, turn and share with someone next to you. What connected with you from the Bible stories we've told? Now, let your partner share. Are you ready? Shh, quiet please. We're about to start. Now let's take a look back at our story so far. The Bible is a sacred story, echoed to us from the ancients. An epic, revealing the great Creator's pursuit of wholeness for all of creation. May we find ourselves in this amazing story. The Creator, a great and mysterious being called God, filled the earth with light and land and every kind of creature, including humans, who reflected God's own image. Looking over creation, God thought, "This is very good." Then, God set aside a day for humans to rest and enjoy being with God. God tried to protect the humans, but Adam and Eve gave in to temptation, believing they could have God's wisdom right away. Pain, struggle, and death entered their world. Later, Adam and Eve's son, Cain, killed his brother Abel in a jealous rage. So Cain was sent away to wander the earth. Before long, civilizations emerged, but humans filled the world with hatred and violence, and God's heart broke. So God decided to start over by sending a flood. But God provided a plan for Noah to save each kind of creature. When the floods came, the ark floated safely on the surface. After the water receded, God stretched a rainbow across the sky as a promise of a new beginning. Then, God made this covenant with a man named Abraham. "This land is for your family, which will be like the stars, too many to count. They'll be my blessing to the entire world." Abraham and his wife Sarah laughed in disbelief. "We never could have children, and now we're too old." But they weren't too old for a miracle. After 25 years, they had Isaac, which means laughter. Isaac and Rebekah had twins. Esau, who foolishly traded his firstborn rights for a bowl of soup. And Jacob, who tricked their father into giving him Esau's blessing. But Jacob ran away because he feared Esau would kill him. Along his journey, a man sent from God wrestled with Jacob and renamed him Israel, meaning struggler with God. Later, Jacob returned, bowing to Esau. And Esau forgave him and welcomed him home. Israel had 12 sons, and his favorite was Joseph. But Joseph's brothers hated him and sold him into slavery. While captive, God gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. Pharaoh was so impressed that he made Joseph second in charge of Egypt. Not long after that, Joseph forgave his brothers and moved all of Israel's family to Egypt. Generations later, Israel's descendants started to fill Egypt. The new Pharaoh felt threatened and forced them into slavery. So God rescued them with incredible signs and wonders. God also sent Moses to lead them out of Egypt. From atop a mountain, God gave the Israelites commands. These were special instructions in the best ways to live. But the people didn't listen and used a golden idol for worship. God did not abandon Israel and chose to dwell in the center of their camp in the tabernacle. God guided them through the desert with a pillar of fire at night and a towering cloud by day. Along the journey, the Israelites complained about being hungry and thirsty. So God answered, raining down manna, sending quail, and making water pour from a rock. But the Israelites still didn't trust God, so they had to wander in the desert for 40 years. Led by Joshua, Israel finally entered the Promised Land. God pushed back the Jordan River, opening a path to cross. To remember this miracle, the Israelites built a monument of stones. Then, the Israelites began to drive out the people living in the Promised Land. First, they marched around Jericho, whose walls crumbled with a loud shout, giving Israel victory. But soon, Israel began a terrible cycle of rebellion. They turned away from God and were conquered by their enemies. So God inspired judges to rescue them. One very wise judge, named Deborah, led Israel to drive out their archenemy, the Canaanites. Another judge, named Gideon, sent a huge Midianite army into a panic, startling them with loud trumpets, smashing jars of clay to reveal flaming torches. But at the end of each judge's life, Israel returned right back to their evil ways. This terrible cycle continued for generations. During the time of the judges, Naomi, an Israelite, and her daughter-in-law Ruth grieved the death of their husbands. Ruth took care of Naomi. While gathering leftover grain for food, she met a man named Boaz. Later, Ruth awoke Boaz, asking, "Cover me with your blanket, for you are my family redeemer." Ruth was symbolically asking to be his wife, and Boaz happily agreed. One of their descendants would someday lead Israel. Soon, the Israelites insisted that they have a king like other nations had. So God chose Saul, a tall, handsome warrior. But Saul treated his people harshly and ignored God's ways. Before long, Saul was overcome with anger and madness. Only the music of his trusted servant David soothed his mind. But when David's popularity grew, Saul drove David into hiding. There, David poured his heart out to God through music called psalms. After Saul was killed in battle, David became king. David made some bad decisions, like having an affair and covering it up. David also faced great trials, like the revolt of his son, Absalom. But David always returned to following God's ways and was loved by all the people. David's son, Solomon, became Israel's most wise and prosperous king, building a magnificent temple for God. But over time, Solomon married foreign wives who turned him away from God. Then, Solomon treated the people of Israel like his slaves. Civil war divided the kingdom into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. Both kingdoms struggled to follow God's ways, so God inspired prophets to confront their rebellion. With a flash of fire, the prophet Elijah showed Israel's evil king Ahab that his god, Baal, was no match for the true God. Chariots and horses of fire later carried Elijah into the clouds. But Israel and Judah continued their rebellion, and both kingdoms were conquered and exiled. While in captivity, a man named Daniel from the kingdom of Judah became a top advisor to Babylon's king and later Persia's king. But jealous Persian leaders created a law against prayer to anyone but the king. When Daniel continued to pray to God, they lowered him into a lion's den to die. But Daniel arose unharmed. So the Persian king proclaimed, "Daniel's God is the one true God." But the people of Judah still lived in exile and longed for their own kingdom. After decades in exile, the people of Judah were finally released to return home and rebuild their temple and the city walls of Jerusalem. After construction was finished, everyone gathered to hear the priest Ezra read God's laws. When they realized how far they had turned from God's ways, the people cried. But Ezra told them to celebrate instead of weep, so they had a huge festival for God. Hundreds of years after their return from exile, the people of Judah, called Jews, were ruled by the mighty Roman Empire. One day, an angel announced to a young woman named Mary that she would give birth to God's son, even though she was a virgin. Miraculously, that next year, Mary had a baby and named him Jesus. News quickly spread that this was the long-awaited Messiah King. Jesus grew wise and strong. When he was 30, Jesus was baptized, and God's Spirit came down and rested on him like a dove. Then Jesus spent 40 days alone in the wilderness. There, Jesus was tempted to turn from God's ways. But Jesus refused to give in, even though he was tired and starving. Soon, Jesus began telling people, "The kingdom of God is here. Turn from your ways and live in God's ways." He called a few people to leave everything they had and be his closest followers, called disciples. Jesus was full of compassion and befriended those whom society considered impure and immoral. Jesus announced, "I bring hope to the poor and the prisoners. The blind will now see. The abused, hurting, and forgotten will be set free." Large crowds followed Jesus as he traveled and healed people of all kinds of sickness. People had never seen anything like this before. Jesus' power to teach and heal filled people with hope. Once, 4 men lowered their paralyzed friend through the roof to see Jesus. When Jesus healed him, the man jumped up and ran home. Another time, Jesus calmed a fierce storm that was sinking the disciples' boat. Later, Jesus prayed over 5 loaves and 2 fish, and, miraculously, the food multiplied enough to feed 5,000 families. Jesus' disciples and everyone who met him were amazed by Jesus. Jesus continued to teach about God's kingdom, saying, "God blesses the humble, the gentle, the poor, the merciful, the grieving, the peacemakers, and the pure in heart. You're God's brilliant light. Let your life shine for all to see." Jesus used parables to compare God's kingdom to everyday things. A tiny seed, a buried treasure, a banquet for outcasts, and on and on. Once, Jesus told a parable about a farmer scattering seeds on different soils. Jesus explained, "We must be like good soil, allowing God's kingdom to take root in our lives. Then we'll grow fruit to bless others." Another time, Jesus told this parable. A son wasted his inheritance on wild living, disgracing his family. But his father didn't disown him. He welcomed him back and encouraged his jealous older son to celebrate that his brother, who was lost, was now found. Jesus taught this about possessions and money. Be like the birds in the air and the lilies in the field. Don't worry about food and clothing. Instead, seek God's kingdom first and give to those in need. Jesus tried to help those he encountered understand God's kingdom. Jesus told Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, to see God's kingdom, you must experience a new birth. This puzzled Nicodemus. Jesus told a Samaritan woman at a well, "I give people living water, so they'll never be thirsty again." Amazed, the woman introduced Jesus to her entire village. When some Pharisees brought an adulterous woman to him to be judged, Jesus said, "The person who has never sinned can throw the first stone." Her accusers left silently. Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey, a symbol of peace. People covered his path with their coats, waved palm branches, and sang to him in hopes that Jesus was their new king. Angered by the lifeless rituals and greed in the temple courts, Jesus chased away the merchants and money changers. Soon, Jesus surprised his disciples by washing their feet like a hired servant. Then, Jesus took some bread and wine and said, "Eat and drink this. It's my body and blood given for you," providing a new covenant with God. Later that night, Jesus went to an olive grove to pray. Some of the religious leaders who were troubled by Jesus' teachings and popularity conspired to have him killed. Late one night, Jesus was captured and brought in for questioning. Jesus' claim that he was God's son enraged the religious leaders. They demanded that the Roman governor put Jesus to death. After savagely beating him, Roman guards crucified Jesus on a wooden cross, and Jesus was buried in a tomb. But then, 3 days later, Jesus' followers saw him. Jesus was alive. After coming back to life, Jesus met with his followers many times. He told them, Soon, God's Spirit will fill you, giving you power to tell the world about me." Then, Jesus ascended into the clouds. Weeks later, God's Spirit filled Jesus' followers, and they began to speak in other languages. Jews from faraway lands were amazed to hear Jesus' followers speaking in their own languages. Thousands chose to follow Jesus and became part of the church. This new community committed themselves to each other and to helping anyone in need. Jesus' disciples, now called apostles, led the church. They traveled from town to town, teaching about Jesus and healing the sick. This offended some religious leaders who threw the apostles into prison. But God sent an angel to open the prison gate during the night and lead the apostles out. Although they were beaten and threatened, the apostles would not stop teaching and healing in Jesus' name. Jesus' followers continued to face harsh persecution. One believer, named Stephen, was put to death for teaching about Jesus. This caused Jesus' followers to scatter all over the region. While traveling, Philip shared about Jesus the Messiah with an Ethiopian official who chose to believe and be baptized. And the good news about Jesus continued to spread. Peter traveled from town to town teaching and healing in Jesus' name. Once he shared, "God showed me that Jesus didn't just come for the Jews. He came to give life to everyone who will follow him." And the church began to welcome anyone who believed. Though he was imprisoned and beaten for his faith, Peter boldly shared about Jesus and shaped the beginnings of the church. Saul, a Pharisee, harshly persecuted the followers of Jesus until Jesus spoke to him in a blinding light. Then Saul became a follower of Jesus and proclaimed that Jesus was the true Messiah. He became known by his Roman name, Paul, as he traveled by road and by ship, helping the church to expand throughout the Roman Empire. He was arrested, beaten, and even left for dead, but he pressed on. In Greece, Paul reasoned with philosophers and persuaded them that in Jesus we live and move and have our being. In Rome, even under house arrest, Paul shared about Jesus the Messiah and sent letters to churches all over the Roman Empire, encouraging them to keep following Jesus. The early church struggled to hold on to its faith in the midst of persecution. While imprisoned, one follower, named John, had an intense vision. In it, Jesus gave him a message to the 7 key churches in Asia. Jesus challenged them to have courage in the midst of dark times. As John's vision continued, he saw Jesus as a lamb, sitting on the throne of God, victorious over evil and death. At the end of this vision, John saw a new heaven and earth descending in front of him, and God living among people again, wiping away every tear, taking away death, sorrow, and pain. For the early churches that were scattered, persecuted, and enticed by the power and wealth of the Roman Empire, John's visions revealed a better future. We, the followers of Jesus, are called to continue this amazing story found in the Bible. We are created to reflect God's image and continue God's creative work. We're called to be God's blessing to all people, extending God's wholeness and love. May our lives echo this amazing story.